I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 17-2. As we continue our look at the Vietnam War, we'll be looking at how the United States involvement in Vietnam begins to escalate or expand. So we'll look at some of the issues and events that caused President Lyndon Baines Johnson to increase American troop strength in Vietnam. We'll assess the nature of the war in Vietnam, the difficulties faced by both sides. We'll evaluate the effects of the low morale on American troops, as well as the growing discontent that will move forward on the home front. Okay, one, compare and contrast American involvement in Vietnam before and after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Before the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and for those who don't recall, in the Gulf of Tonkin, American ships were fired upon off the coast of North Vietnam. President Johnson went to Congress, and he was given by the Congress unchecked war powers with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed Johnson to wage war in Vietnam however he saw fit. So prior to the Gulf of Tonkin, the United States worked with the Vietnamese government in an advisory capacity. After the resolution, the United States began an all-out war against North Vietnam. What two people impacted Johnson's decision to escalate American involvement in Vietnam? The two primary advisors would be the General William Westmoreland, who was in charge of American forces in Vietnam, and then the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. So under the advisement and counsel of these two, he decided to escalate the war. Three-headed Operation Rolling Thunder impact American involvement in Vietnam. In March 1965, LBJ expanded American involvement by shifting the policy to a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The constant bombing in North Vietnam, almost like carpet bombing, our bombs are not as precise as they are in contemporary times, and as a result, we were hitting a lot of different areas, civilian targets, infrastructure, things like that maybe weren't our first targets, and we basically just continued to bomb North Vietnam, and that was nicknamed Operation Rolling Thunder. Shortly thereafter, he sent in the first American combat troops who fought side by side with the South Vietnamese troops. One of the biggest challenges for the United States fighting in Vietnam was the dense, hot, damp jungles. And as a result, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were able to hide constantly, and it was very difficult for the United States to target and find the enemy. So they had two different substances they were going to use to destroy the foliage and expose the Vietnamese hiding places. They used napalm, which is a jellied gasoline that exploded on contact, as well as Agent Orange, a chemical that strips leaves from trees and shrubs, turning farmland and forest into a vast wasteland. One of the unforeseen and unfortunate consequences of the use of napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam was a long-lasting negative impact it had on the Vietnamese people. Napalm and Agent Orange were destructive to the people in the land of Vietnam. Napalm caused serious burns and widespread destruction. When villages were bombed with napalm, Vietnamese people lost their homes. And then Agent Orange seeped into the ground and got into the groundwater and the vegetation and the crops they were growing. And as a result, it led to serious birth defects in the aftermath of Vietnam. You see a couple disturbing images there from the aftermath of Vietnam, some of the birth defects that were attributed to the use of these chemicals in Vietnam. Seven, the United States had superior force and a large number of troops in Vietnam. Why was this not enough to win the war quickly? Well, many South Vietnamese outside the cities did not support the government, so therefore they gave coverage to some of the North Vietnamese troops. The Viet Cong guerrilla tactics were among the most effective tactics that the North Vietnamese used, and what they were doing is they were hiding, then they'd hit the American troops and run and blend back into the regular population. Eventually, these tactics would wear down the Americans' ability to fight and prevented them from having decisive victories. Then there was also the ambushes and booby traps that the North Vietnamese had. They also had an elaborate tunnel system underneath the ground where allowed for them to hide. And by blending into the general population, they avoided American pursuit. 8, how did the Americans' search and destroy missions attempt to counteract the Viet Cong's tactics? Well, they hoped to find the enemy troops, bomb their positions, destroy their supply lines, and force them into the open. Ho Chi Minh explained that his Viet Cong guerrillas fought like a tiger against an elephant. Explain this simile in your own words, and then come up with your own comparison that describes how the Vietnamese and American forces fought. You can think about that on your own. So Ho Chi Minh's fighters traveled lightly and struck quickly and unexpectedly. He believed that these small strikes would have a lasting effect. It was like being stung by bees. Many small wounds could become unbearable and cause you to stop standing near the hive. So one bee sting is not going to be a huge deterrent, but multiple ones would certainly be problematic. 10, how did the Ho Chi Minh Trail help the Viet Cong? Well, if you notice the Ho Chi Minh Trail that's characterized here, it's going through neighboring countries, Laos and Cambodia, which allowed the North Vietnamese to move troops and supplies without American troops to stop them. So they basically moved them out of the country. Therefore, the United States was not willing initially to expand the fighting into other countries, and therefore the North Vietnamese had a free path from one portion of North Vietnam into the attack spots in South Vietnam. A stated goal of the Vietnam War is to win the hearts and minds of the average Vietnamese citizens. Did the American tactics support this goal? No, the Americans were unable to set up an anti-communist regime that was desirable for all Vietnamese. Instead, the U.S. came to Vietnam and used destructive weapons that hurt civilians as well as the Viet Cong. The American support for a corrupt government that was prejudiced against Buddhism was also something that was sticking in the minds of many of the Vietnamese. All of these tactics created more resentment than actual support. '12, how many American troops were in Vietnam in 1965 versus 1968? So in 1965, we had 184,000 troops. 3 years later, it more than doubled. But the fatality rates, the deaths in 1965 were 636 versus 30,000 in 1968. So the loss of life was extensive. 13, when the United States started sending troops to Vietnam, they could not fight in the same way they did during World War II. Why couldn't the United States use the same strategies in both wars? In World War II, the United States wanted to gain ground from the enemy. In the Vietnam War, the United States had to avoid gaining ground because it may trigger action from China or the Soviet Union. So the Cold War, the broader Cold War in the background. Remember, Vietnam's another proxy war, very similar to Korea, where the United States is supporting the Democratic side and the Soviet Union and the Chinese are supporting their communist allies in North Vietnam. And additionally, C, for 13, the United States military was ill prepared to respond to the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, something they really didn't experience or have to deal with much during World War II. 14, how did the Vietnam War impact the way people viewed military service? Before the Vietnam War, many Americans did not challenge the government's war efforts because a medic said, when your country needs you, you just go. You simply go. You don't ask a lot of questions. However, one effect of the Vietnam War was that more people questioned the government's strategy and motives when it sent troops into a foreign country. Let me just reorganize this. Okay, in 15, by 1965, the majority of Americans fighting in the war had been drafted to do so. How might the fact they were drafted impact support for the war? Well, drafted soldiers in general are less enthusiastic about fighting in any war. Drafted soldiers began questioning why in the world are they even in Vietnam. Friends and family who began to receive letters from the battlefield began to question the war as well. So the lack of a, clear direction for the war was also something that was really problematic. 16, when the United States became involved in Vietnam, how did Lyndon Baines Johnson and Americans believe the war would go? Most Americans and Johnson wrongfully expected a quick and overwhelming victory for the United States. Which two nations aided North Vietnam? Why did this alarm American leadership? Well, we alluded to it earlier. Communist China and the Soviet Union. There was a fear of a broader world war breaking out over Vietnam. 18, why was Johnson's war strategy flawed? He was afraid of the Chinese or the Soviets getting directly involved by committing troops, so he fought a war of attrition, meaning he hoped to get the North Vietnamese to eventually quit rather than decisively defeating them, which would have been a more aggressive tactic. 19, how did Johnson's policies in Vietnam impact his Great Society programs? Between the Vietnam War and the Great Society, federal government spending skyrocketed, the deficit was going up. Johnson was forced to raise taxes, reduce Great Society programs in order to pay for the Vietnam War. So wars are choices. Obviously in a case like this, we chose to fight in the war opposed to using those expenditures for the citizens who might have needed that money in our country. 20, who are the hawks and the doves? Hawks are generally war hawks, people who insisted the United States continue to fight in Vietnam. Doves, these are usually people who are against the war, and these are the people who opposed the war and demanded the United States withdraw from Vietnam. Just got a little note in there. We have pro-war and pacifists or anti-war. Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat. How do you think the tension between conservative hawks and liberal doves impacted his political power? Some Democrats who agreed with Johnson's policies about civil rights, and others disagreed with his stance on the war. So you had kind of a conflict there. This means that Johnson had to fight people in his own party. He sent increasingly larger numbers of troops and expended increasingly larger amounts of money in Vietnam. This weakened his political power. The hearings held by Senator Fulbright probably weakened it even more because it gave Johnson's opponents a way to publicly criticize his policies in Vietnam. Lesson reflection, why was the Vietnam War such a challenging war for the government to maintain public support for? Well, it was the first war to be covered daily on the nightly news, on TV. To many Americans, we lacked a clear rationale for being there. And the protest movement, as well as draft dodgers, created resentment within population groups in our country. So hopefully you enjoyed our ongoing discussions here of American involvement in the Vietnam War. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.